Just 2 years ago, a blue ribbon, carefully picked panel on U.S. national security in the 21st century, including retired military brass and intelligence experts, concluded that a significant terrorist attack, much like the one on Tuesday, could be on its way. That was 2 years ago. Also on that commission were former members of Congress. Two of them join us now to discuss their findings. The former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and former longtime member of the House International Relations Committee, Lee Hamilton. Thanks for being with us, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, what were the recommendations of the commission at that time?
Well, the final recommendation actually came out in March of this year, and the number one item that we unanimously agreed on was that we had to be prepared not just for what we had this week, as terrible as that is, but we had to be prepared for a weapon of mass destruction, biological, chemical, or nuclear, being used in an American city. And we strongly, unanimously recommended that we establish a Homeland Security Agency that focuses on dealing with the consequences of terrorism or the consequences of weapons going off here in the United States. And I think if you look at the scale of what's happening in New York and recognize that this is not the big event we described, this is a horrible event, but there are potentials in the next 15 or 20 years for much bigger, much worse events. You can see why we felt so strongly that we need a Homeland Security Agency.
Well, Chairman Hamilton, what are some of those other events that you say that we may very well face in the short, medium, perhaps long run?
Well, there are a long list of them. The worst that the Speaker was referring to a moment ago would be the weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear. We think all of that is possible. We said and agreed unanimously on the point that Americans are not as secure as they think they are, and that Americans, perhaps in large numbers, could die on American soil. So we think that fighting terrorism is the number one national security threat. That was a controversial statement when we made it, much less controversial now after these events of September 11. But I think all of the commissioners, and they were people of very diverse political backgrounds, political views, were unanimous that this is the number one threat now. And that means a lot of changes in the way we organize ourselves in the government, in the resources we devote to terrorism.
Speaker Gingrich, how do we meet this challenge? How do we take care of our security and not have it be at the expense of our civil liberties? Or is that possible?
Well, I think Lee and I would agree that our commission was unanimous that to give up our civil liberties, to cease to be free, would be to have terrorism win by default. That the whole point here is we are a free, prosperous country. We are largely a safe country by the standards of history. And our job, the challenge for Americans in the next generation, is to develop both a defense and an offense that stops terrorism from forcing us into precisely the things you were describing. I would say that we believe strongly that if you were to create a Homeland Security Agency as a cabinet-level position built around the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but including the Coast Guard, including the Immigration Service part that deals with people coming into the country, including the Border Patrol and Customs. So you had one single unified agency dealing with incoming traffic. If at the same time we freed up our intelligence agencies and financed them correctly so that they could pursue terrorism around the world. And we said, and this, as Lee said, several of these things were pretty controversial. We said quite explicitly that there are circumstances where we should be prepared as a country to preempt terrorists if we believe there's a risk that they're going to bring a weapon of mass destruction in the United States. And I would argue that's a much more aggressive, much more outward-oriented look towards going after terrorism than we've seen. Certainly what the President, what Secretary Powell and others have said in the last 3 days would imply moving very dramatically in the direction of that kind of aggressive, let's go get evil over there before evil arrives here in the U.S.
My colleague Ed Bradley has a question.
Speaker Gingrich, Congressman Hamilton, what was the reaction to this recommendation of a Homeland Security Agency?
Well, we've testified on it several times in the Congress. We came up with a very detailed plan as to how you should organize the federal government. We said explicitly that the federal government is fragmented, doesn't have strong leadership, isn't organized in a way that is that can coordinate plans and implement plans, And so we presented a very detailed plan. Anybody who knows Washington knows that when you begin to shuffle the boxes around in an organizational chart, the Customs, Border Patrol, and these things, you create a lot of opposition. And sure enough, when we appeared before the congressional committees, every member of Congress had their own idea.
So the bottom line is, at this point, there's been no action taken on your recommendations.
There are about 50 recommendations. About 34 or 35 are in the process of being acted on in one manner or the other.
Do you think they would have made a difference in this case, since you were looking at weapons of mass destruction?
Who can tell? That's an impossible question to answer. We think the United States government would be much more effectively organized and prepared for a massive terrorist attack if it adopted our recommendations.
And Ed, let me say that Vice President Cheney has been tasked by President Bush with reviewing the options on Homeland Security. That report was to come out in October. And I think all of the members of the Commission, we were with Gary Hart and Warren Rudman, our chairman, today at lunch, and all the members of the Commission felt strongly that we had proposed things in March. The administration has certainly taken them seriously. We've met with all the senior members of the administration on these items. As Lee just said, about 34 of them in one form or another are moving forward. But in the absence of a crisis, you know, back in March, when we said the U.S. could be hit here at home, people didn't have a sense of urgency. It didn't seem real.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry we're out of time, and I take your point. I think people now will consider it very real. Thank you very much, both of you, for being with us.
Thank you.
CBS News continuing coverage of the attack on America continues.